Hello, this is Angeline here. I'm so good, I'm so well, and I hope you're well too, keeping safe. Happy Wednesday. This is another day that the Lord has made. He has given us another free day. I'm so glad I'm here. Thank you for watching this. Yesterday I talked about self-worth. Today I've realized there are so many things that describe me. I'm just going to mention some of these words that go with self. There's so much. We've been talking about self-awareness, self-care, self-love, self-worth. Now, how many others do we have? There are so many. Self-pity, self-biasness, self-born, self-bred, self-coop, self-dead. There is self-harm, self-heal, self-help, self-skill, self-life, self-made, self-pity, self-rule, self-swan, self-suck, self-talk, self-view, self-will, selfless, self-caged, self-won, self-abuse, self-acted, self-actor, self-being, self-black, self-blame, self-blood, self-brand, self-break, self-build, self-color, self-death, self-doubt, self-drive, self-image, self-limit, self-move, self-pride, self-right, self-serving, self-serve, self-sown, self-study, self-trust, self-worth, self-wrong, self-denial, self-guarded, selflessly, self-abased, self-abuser, self-acting, self-action, self-active, self-affine, self-arrest, self-belief, self-binder, self-bounty, self-buried, self-accused, self-centered, self-cooker, self-color, self-deceit, self-denial, self-deport, self-hating, self-hatred, self-images, self-injured, self-skilled, self-killed, self-loaded, self-loving, self-meddled, self-motion, self-moving, self-murder, self-parody, self-police, self-praise, self-styled, self-taught, self-titled, self-tuning, self-willed, self-unjoined, self-seeded, self-seeker, self-assured, self-evident, self-fullness, self-healing, self-abasing, self-accused, self-adjoined, self-affairs, self-antigen, self-assumed, self-assured, self-billing, self-blipped, self-bondage, self-central, self-centered, self-charity, self-closing, self-cooking, self-colored, self-command, self-commune, self-conceit, self-concept, self-concerned, self-conduct, self-devoted, self-disgust, self-inquiry, self-evident, self-inflict, self-loading, self-locking, self-mastery, self-neglect, self-offense, self-opinion, self-pollute, self-posited, self-protein, self-pulsing, self-raising, self-reliant, self-reprove, self-rescuer, self-respect, self-sealing, self-seeking, self-serving, self-similar, self-starter, self-sterile, self-storage, self-support, self-surgery, self-tapping, self-torment, self-torture, self-voicing, self-winding, self-worship, self-assembly, self-centered, self-energies, selflessness, self-made hero, self-promoter, self-sameness, self-absorbed, self-accusing, self-acquired, self-activating, self-adversive, self-advocacy, self-affected, self-infinity, self-aligning, self-analyzing, analyze, self-applause, self-applying, self-assemble, self-assembly, self-assigned, self-banished, self-baptizer, self-begotten, self-betrayal, self-bleeping, self-boasting, self-buckling, self-catering, self-composed, self-concept, self-contempt, self-critical, self-deceived, self-defended, self-delusion, self-depraved, self-distract, self-efficacy, self-elitive, self-employed, self-enclosed, self-evidence, self-evidency, self-existent, self-flattery, self-focusing, self-glorious, self-hardening, self-homicide, self-hypnosis, self-exposure, self-ignition, self-ignorance, self-injuring, self-interest, self-involved, self-learning, self-polluted, self-pollutes, self-portray, self-positing, self-produced, self-referent, self-reliance, self-religion, self-reproach, self-reproved, self-rescuers, self-violence, self-assembled, self-slaughter, self-abandoned, self-abasement, self-actualized, self-addressed, self-adjacent, self-adjusting, self-appointed, self-achieving, self-assertive, self-assurance, self-averaging, self-awareness, self-balancing, self-confiding, self-conjugate, self-conscious, self-consuming, self-contained, self-contented, self-convicted, self-criticism, self-deception, self-defeating, self-defensive, self-denial, denyingly, self-dependent, self-depending, self-destroyer, self-destruct, self-devouring, self-insurance, self-justifying, self-ownership, self-assessing, self-consistency, self-excitation, self-fleshness, self-abhorrent, self-abnective, self-absorption, self-adjusting, self-administering, self-admiration, self-affliction, there are so many, repetition, self-reproached, self-respectful, self-restrained, self-revelation, self-similarity, self-abandonment, self-adjournment, self-realization, self-referential, self-reproaching, self-actualization, self-administration, self-authenticating, self-congratulation, self-experimentation, self-objectification, self-synchronization, self-titled, self-homebrewed, there are so many so many things we do to ourselves. That goes to what is said, that anything that happens around us, it is about 85 to 90% what you do to what is happening around us than, or think about and act to, than what others are going to do about it. Okay? So self-actualization, it is you making yourself achieve your desired results and goals. It is 99% to 95% of what I do to achieve those goals than what my environment provides for me, like education, food, environment, shelter, every other thing that goes with my achievement. Thank you. Subscribe, ask questions. We'll talk about that. So I was just trying to say there's so much about self that talking about self-awareness, self-care, and just self, it is hard to finish. There's so much. So ask your questions,